President, this bill makes arrangements for a second airport for Sydney at Badgerys Creek in Western Sydney, and clearly Sydney does need a second airport. That mascot, Kingsford Smith, is at capacity, but I wonder whether the need for it, the urgency, would be as great if we had some high-speed rail links in this country, particularly between Sydney and Canberra and Sydney and Melbourne and Sydney and Brisbane. Sydney Airport Corporation has the right of first refusal to develop and manage the new airport. This option was part of the original privatisation deal that saw the airport sold for $5.6 billion by the Howard government in 2002. The privatisation of Sydney Airport, creating a monopoly out of our largest and oldest airport, has been a disaster for Sydney and the nation. Now we are considering a bill that makes arrangements to possibly extend that monopoly to the new airport, cementing high costs services for the travelling public for decades to come. Many formerly state-owned enterprises have been privatised since the 1980s, and sometimes not with a good result for the public. From the Commonwealth Bank to Telstra to electricity grids, and in my home state of South Australia, the state government is crazily trying to privatise the Motor Accident Commission. But the privatisation of Sydney Airport has to take the cake as the craziest of all. It wasn't inevitable. The federal government didn't have to privatise the airport, and it didn't have to include a first right of refusal for any second airport within 100 kilometres of Mascot, guaranteeing not only a monopoly now and into the future, if that's what the new owners wanted. Back in 2002, it was thought to be a high price, but 13 years on, and it's clear that Macquarie Bank got Australia's largest and oldest airport for a bargain. But it has gained a reputation for providing overpriced, low levels of service to those who have to use the airport as a private monopoly. Sydney Airport Corporation has pretty much charged what it liked for its services, including to the airlines and the travelling public, via landing and car parking fees. The landing fees, Mr Acting Deputy President, and you know through chairing Regional and Rural Affairs and Transport Committee inquiries, the landing fees for Qantas, for Australian Airlines, are exponentially higher than they are for comparable overseas airports, and it is a rip-off. The ACCC is on the record as being concerned at the privileged place Sydney Airport Corporation has in extending its monopoly. Each year, the ACCC looks at the prices set by airports and it has found Sydney Airport charges the most exorbitant parking rates of any airport in Australia. In fact, Mr Acting Deputy President, I think it's way up there on an international level. For example, it costs drivers $32 for 3 hours or $135 for 7 days in the longer-term car park. These charges generate a revenue of $120 million in the last reporting year, up 4.9% in margin on the previous year. Why do they do it? Because they can get away with it as a monopoly, and they will do it again at Badgerys Creek if they decide to take up the option to develop, which I suspect they will. The issue of landing and parking fees to airlines has also been a sore point in Sydney. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce, and Mr Acting Deputy President, no one could accuse me of being mates with Alan Joyce. No one could accuse me of being mates with Alan Joyce. And he can't do anything about this. I even got a lawyer's letter from him over something I said about him, but we sorted that one out, Mr Acting Deputy President. Qantas CEO Alan Joyce is on the record as saying Australian airports could charge fees for oxygen if they could, and that Sydney Airport was amongst the highest charges. And on this issue, I agree with Mr Joyce and his advocacy. He's absolutely right, and he's speaking not just for his company, for Qantas, but for all Australian airlines that want a fair go, and for consumers that are being ripped off. But it just doesn't end there. Credible reports from Michael West and Fairfax Media show that Sydney Airport Corporation pays little or no tax to the federal government. According to Mr West, a very experienced business journalist, Sydney Airport didn't pay any tax in its first 10 years, but has delivered more than $1 billion in fees to advisors and financiers. Because it's a monopoly, it can afford to carry huge debts, and it claims interest on that debt as a tax deduction, and that effectively cancels out any profits. But the real profits are soaked up in hundreds of millions of dollars in fees to its backers and financiers each year. It's a nice little earner, Mr Acting Deputy President. This monopoly privatised corporate entity generates about $700 million in financing costs, soaked up by Macquarie Bank clients and bankers, advisors and security holders. And to quote Rupert Murdoch, a monopoly is a terrible thing unless you happen to own one. No wonder the ACCC has openly questioned why Sydney Airport received a first right of refusal to operate a second Sydney airport. In its Airport Updates 2013, the ACCC said that separate owners of the two Sydney airports would encourage lower prices, increased capacity and quality for customers. But that's not to be. Unfortunately, the report said, in this case, short-term budgetary considerations have served to undermine the competitive framework that delivers improved services and lower prices within a market economy, the ACCC report says. And who, Mr Acting Deputy President, will pay in the long run for this undermining of competition? It will be the people of Australia, particularly the hapless passengers who have to travel through Sydney Airport and get ripped off day in, day out, and those who must travel through its airports, including many from my home state of South Australia who catch connecting flights, particularly to the United States and across the Pacific. It hasn't been that long since the privatisation, just 13 years. In that time, Sydney Airport has had 3 CEOs, but its first, Max Moore-Wilton, is now the chair of Sydney Airport Holdings, which owns 84% of Sydney Airport. He has come a long way since those days before the privatisation when he was Secretary of the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet. He left to take up the helm of Sydney Airport Corporation just months later. He now has the unprecedented opportunity to create a privately owned, multi-site airport monopoly in Sydney. Sydney Airport might not be the only private company that charges like a wounded bull and structures itself to pay as little tax as possible, but it is Australian and was created by our federal government. The privatisation of Sydney Airport has been a disaster, and that disaster is set to continue if Sydney Airport Corporation decides to take up its option to develop and operate Sydney's second airport. We will rue the day if that happens, Mr Acting Deputy President.
Thank you.